The hands that had once braided wildflowers now trembled beneath worn leather gloves, carrying secrets that burned deeper than the Texas sun. Ruth Jameson pressed her palms against her skirt, feeling the raised flesh beneath the hide, each scar a word in a language she prayed no one would ever learn to read. The rescue had come 3 months too late to save her innocence, but perhaps just in time to save her life. Now standing at the edge of Ten Crow's healing lodge, she wondered if some wounds were meant to remain hidden forever. The Comanche healer's dark eyes seemed to see through everything: walls, lies, carefully constructed facades. What if he discovered that her hands held more than just scars? Subscribe to witness Ruth's journey from captivity to an unexpected gift that will change everything. The morning light filtered through the buffalo hide walls of Ten Crow's lodge like whispered prayers, casting amber shadows across the earthen floor where Ruth sat with her hands buried deep in her lap. She had learned to make herself small during the months of captivity, shoulders curved inward, eyes downcast, breath shallow as a sparrow's. The habit clung to her now like smoke from a dying fire, even though the iron shackles had been cut away weeks ago. Ten Crow moved around her with the quiet grace of a man who understood that healing began with patience, his moccasined feet making no sound on the packed earth. The scent of sage and sweetgrass hung heavy in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of fear that seemed to seep from her very pores. She watched him from beneath lowered lashes as he prepared his medicines, noting how his weathered hands moved with certainty over dried roots and mysterious powders. His fingers were long and elegant, unmarked by the violence that had shaped her own, and she found herself wondering what it would feel like to touch something, someone, without causing pain. The thought sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the morning chill. Ten Crow had been patient with her silence, never pushing for words she wasn't ready to give, but she could feel his curiosity like a gentle pressure against her carefully constructed walls. He knew there was more to her story than what the cavalry had reported, a settler's daughter taken in a raid, held for 3 months, then found wandering the plains half dead from thirst and exposure. The leather gloves she wore had become like a second skin, so familiar now that she sometimes forgot they weren't part of her body. Beneath them, her palms itched with a strange warmth that had nothing to do with the Texas heat and everything to do with the secret she carried. During her captivity, when the pain had been too much to bear, something had awakened in her hands. A tingling sensation that seemed to draw the hurt from her body and transform it into something else entirely. She had touched a dying warrior once, when no one was watching, and felt his fever break beneath her palms. The memory terrified her more than any of the violence she had endured, because it meant she was changing into something she didn't understand. Ten Crow's voice, when he finally spoke, was like water over smooth stones. "The body remembers what the mind tries to forget," he said without turning from his work. "But sometimes, what we think is a curse is actually a gift waiting to be unwrapped." His words hit her like a physical blow, and she pressed her hidden hands more firmly against her stomach, feeling the scars pulled tight beneath the leather. How could he know? How could anyone know about the strange heat that lived in her palms, the way her touch seemed to ease suffering even as her own heart remained broken? She had been so careful, so vigilant about keeping her secret buried beneath layers of shame and silence. The morning stretched between them like a held breath, filled with all the words she couldn't say and all the truths she couldn't bear to reveal. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the camp awakening, children's laughter, the soft nickering of horses, the rhythmic thud of women grinding corn. It was a peaceful sound, so different from the harsh voices and cruel laughter that had filled her world for 3 long months. Yet even here, in this place of healing and safety, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still a captive, not of iron chains or cruel masters, but of her own fear and the terrible secret that lived beneath her gloves. The weight of hidden wounds, she was learning, could be heavier than any shackle ever forged. Ten Crow had seen enough broken spirits to recognize the particular way Ruth held herself, like a bird with clipped wings who had forgotten she was meant to fly. Her rescue from the Kiowa raiders had brought her to his lodge more dead than alive, her body bearing the visible marks of captivity, while her soul carried wounds that ran deeper than flesh. For 3 weeks now, he had watched her sit in the same spot each morning, hands hidden beneath those worn leather gloves, eyes fixed on some distant horizon that existed only in her memory. The other women of the camp whispered that she was touched by spirits, that her silence was a sign of madness. But Ten Crow saw something different in the careful way she moved, the deliberate precision with which she kept her hands concealed. There was power in her stillness, a coiled energy that reminded him of the moment before lightning strikes. He had felt it the first time she entered his lodge. A subtle shift in the air, as if the very spirits of healing had stirred in recognition of something familiar. His grandmother had taught him to read the signs that others missed, to see beyond the surface wounds to the deeper currents that flowed through a person's spirit. Ruth carried the mark of one who had been chosen by forces greater than herself, though she seemed determined to deny whatever gift had been awakened within her. The gloves she wore were not just protection from the world's gaze. They were a barrier against her own power. He moved around her with deliberate slowness, allowing her to grow accustomed to his presence, the way a wild horse learns to trust the gentle approach of a patient trainer. Each day, he performed his healing rituals within her sight, letting her observe the sacred dance between medicine and spirit that had been passed down through generations of his people. Sometimes he caught her watching, with an intensity that spoke of recognition, as if some part of her understood the ancient rhythms he followed. Her breathing would change during these moments, becoming deeper and more centered, and he could sense the walls around her heart beginning to soften like ice in spring sunshine. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the lodge walls with shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance in rhythm with the sage smoke rising from his fire. Ten Crow began to prepare a poultice for the infected wound on her shoulder, a reminder of the violence she had endured. But as he worked, he found himself speaking the old words his grandmother had taught him about the nature of healing. "Pain is not always the enemy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it is the teacher that shows us where our true strength lies hidden." He saw her stiffen at his words, saw the way her hidden hands clenched into fists beneath the leather, and knew he had touched something raw and unhealed within her spirit. Ruth's silence stretched between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. But Ten Crow had learned patience from the desert itself, from the way water finds its path through stone, from the way seeds wait through winter for their moment to bloom. He could feel her watching him as he ground the healing herbs, could sense the questions she was afraid to ask, burning behind her carefully guarded eyes. There was something she needed to tell him, some burden she carried that was heavier than her physical wounds, but he knew that pushing would only drive her deeper into the fortress of her fear. Instead, he continued his work, letting the rhythm of mortar against stone speak the language of patience and acceptance. The scent of crushed willow bark and prairie sage filled the lodge, carrying with it the promise of healing and the whisper of ancient wisdom. Ten Crow had seen many broken souls pass through his care, but none had carried the particular combination of terror and power that radiated from this young woman like heat from a banked fire. Her hands, whatever secrets they held, were the key to understanding not just her trauma, but her destiny. He could feel it in the way the very air seemed to respond to her presence, in the way his own healing spirits stirred restlessly whenever she was near. The greatest healers, his grandmother had always said, were often those who had first learned to heal themselves. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lodge when Ten Crow found Ruth sitting by the dying embers, her hands buried deep in the folds of her skirt. She had not slept. He could see it in the hollow spaces beneath her eyes, in the way her shoulders curved inward like a bird protecting its wounded wing. The coffee he had left for her sat untouched, growing cold in the clay cup, and when she looked up at his approach, there was something wild and cornered in her gaze that made him move slower, gentler, as if approaching a deer that might bolt at any sudden movement. "The spirits were restless last night," he said quietly, settling himself across from her with the careful distance of someone who understood the geography of trauma. "Sometimes they speak loudest when we are trying hardest not to listen." Ruth's fingers tightened in her skirt, and he watched the small movement with the trained eye of a healer who had learned to read the body's secret language. There was pain there, yes, but something else too, something that hummed beneath her skin like a song she was afraid to sing. The silence stretched between them, filled with the morning sounds of the camp awakening, children's laughter, the soft nickering of horses, the rhythmic thud of women grinding corn. But here in the lodge, the quiet felt sacred, pregnant with possibilities that neither of them dared name. Ten Crow reached for his medicine bundle, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and began to lay out the tools of his trade. Sage for cleansing, sweetgrass for calling in good spirits, small pouches of herbs whose names Ruth did not know, but whose purposes she could somehow sense in the deepest parts of herself. "Your body remembers things your mind has forgotten," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And your hands." He paused, watching the way she flinched at the word, the way her whole being seemed to contract around the secret she carried. "Your hands remember most of all." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, and Ruth felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking, but opening, like a seed that had been waiting too long in the dark earth for the first touch of spring rain. She wanted to run, wanted to gather her skirts and flee back to the burnt homestead where she could hide among the ashes and ruins of her old life. But something in Ten Crow's eyes held her. Not force, not demand, but a kind of patient, knowing that made her feel seen in a way that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. He had looked at broken things before, she realized. He had held them in his hands and found ways to make them whole again. When he finally spoke again, his words were like a prayer offered to the morning wind. "Show me what you're afraid I'll see, and I'll show you what the spirits have been trying to tell you all along." Ruth's hands emerged from her skirt like pale birds rising from dark water, and Ten Crow felt his breath catch in his throat, not from revulsion, but from recognition. The scars that covered her palms and fingers were not random marks of violence, but patterns, intricate as the designs his grandmother had once carved into sacred gourds. Burns, yes, but burns that had been made with purpose, with intention, each mark placed with the precision of someone who understood the ancient maps written in flesh and bone. "They made me touch the iron," she whispered, her voice so small it was almost lost in the morning air. Every time something happened that they couldn't explain. When their sick horses got well after I'd been near them, when their wounded warriors healed faster than they should have." Her fingers trembled as she turned her palms upward, revealing the full extent of the scarring, and Ten Crow saw now what he had only sensed before. The way the marks seemed to pulse with their own inner light, the way the air around her hands shimmered like heat rising from summer stone. He had heard stories of such things from the old ones, whispered tales of healers whose gifts were so powerful they burned like fire in their hands, whose touch could call the dead back from the spirit world or send the living across the threshold between worlds. His own grandmother had spoken of a white woman generations ago who had come to their people with hands that glowed like stars and a heart that understood the language of pain. But he had thought them only stories, legends meant to teach, rather than truth meant to be lived. "They were afraid of you," he said, and it was not a question, but a statement of fact that settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. "They hurt you because they could not understand what you carried." Ruth nodded, tears tracking silver paths down her cheeks, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of years of silence, of secrets buried so deep they had almost forgotten how to breathe. "I can feel it sometimes," she said, her scarred fingers curling and uncurling like flowers opening and closing to the sun. "When someone is hurt, when they're dying, it's like something inside me reaches out without my permission, like my hands know things my mind doesn't." She looked up at him then, and in her eyes, he saw the terrible burden of a gift that had brought her nothing but pain, a blessing that had been twisted into a curse by those who could not see its true nature. Ten Crow reached into his medicine bundle and withdrew a small piece of turquoise, smooth and warm from years of handling. He placed it gently in Ruth's scarred palm, and both of them gasped as the stone began to glow with a soft blue light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. The scars on her hands grew warm, not with the burning pain of memory, but with something else, something that felt like coming home after a long journey through darkness. "The spirits have been waiting for you," he said, his voice filled with wonder and something that might have been reverence. "All this time, they have been waiting for you to remember who you really are." The turquoise pulsed in Ruth's palm like a captured piece of sky, and with each beat of light, she felt something ancient and familiar stirring in the deepest chambers of her heart. Ten Crow watched her face transform, watched the fear and shame give way to something that looked almost like recognition, as if she were remembering a dream she had forgotten upon waking. The scars on her hands no longer seemed like marks of punishment, but like sacred tattoos, each burn a doorway to power that had been locked away for too long. "My grandmother told me once that the greatest healers are always wounded first," Ten Crow said, his voice soft with memory and reverence. "She said the spirits choose those who understand suffering because only they can truly understand healing." He reached for another stone from his bundle, this one black as midnight and smooth as river water, and placed it beside the turquoise in Ruth's other palm. The two stones began to resonate together, their combined light casting dancing shadows on the lodge walls that seemed to move with purpose and intention. Ruth felt the power flowing through her like water through a dry riverbed, filling spaces in her soul that she had not even known were empty. The pain that had lived in her hands for so long began to transform, not disappearing but changing into something else, something that felt like strength, like purpose, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through winter earth. She understood now why the Comanche had feared her, why they had tried to burn the gift out of her with hot iron and cruel words. They had recognized something in her that she herself had not yet learned to name. "I can feel them," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder and a kind of holy terror. "All the people who are hurting, all the ones who need—" She trailed off, overwhelmed by the sudden awareness of pain and need that seemed to stretch across the plains, like an invisible web connecting every living thing. Ten Crow nodded, understanding flooding his features, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy and promise. "You are not just a healer," he said, his dark eyes reflecting the light that now seemed to emanate from her very skin. "You are a bridge between worlds, a translator of pain into hope." He stood slowly, his movements ceremonial and deliberate, and began to gather herbs from his bundles, sage and cedar, sweetgrass and something else that Ruth could not name, but whose purpose she could feel singing in her bones. The ritual that followed was unlike anything Ruth had ever experienced, a dance of smoke and song that seemed to call down the very stars from their courses. Ten Crow's voice rose and fell in ancient rhythms, and Ruth found herself joining in without knowing the words, her scarred hands moving in patterns that felt as natural as breathing. The lodge filled with light that had no earthly source, and in that light Ruth saw visions of the work that lay ahead, hands reaching out in darkness, wounds that needed tending, hearts that had forgotten how to hope. When the ceremony ended and the last of the smoke had drifted away through the lodge opening, Ruth looked down at her hands and saw that the scars had not disappeared, but had been transformed. Each mark now glowing with a soft inner light that would never fade, the permanent sign of a healer who had finally come home to herself. 3 seasons had passed since the night Ruth's hands first blazed with healing light, and the Comanche camp had grown accustomed to the sight of the pale woman working alongside Ten Crow, her scarred fingers now moving with the confidence of one who had found her true calling. The children no longer stared when she passed, and the elders nodded with respect when she entered their lodges, carrying pouches of herbs and the quiet authority that came from understanding pain. Her hands, once hidden in shame, now bore the silver tracery of her scars like badges of honor, each line a testament to survival and transformation. The lodge she shared with Ten Crow had become a place of pilgrimage for the wounded, both in body and spirit, and Ruth had learned to read the language of suffering in ways that went beyond words or tribal boundaries. She could sense the fever breaking in a child before the mother knew to hope, could feel the grief lodged in an old warrior's chest like a stone that needed gentle coaxing to dissolve. Her gift had grown stronger with each passing moon, fed by the love that had bloomed between her and the man who had first seen past her terror to the healer within. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the camp settled into peaceful slumber, Ruth would sit beside the fire and study her hands in the flickering light, marveling at how something once broken could become so beautiful. The scars that had once filled her with shame now seemed to pulse with their own inner warmth, as if the very wounds that had nearly destroyed her had become the source of her greatest strength. Ten Crow would watch her in these moments, his dark eyes soft with understanding, knowing that she was not just examining her hands, but celebrating the journey that had brought them both to this place of healing. The white world she had once known seemed like a distant dream now, faded and insubstantial, compared to the vivid reality of her life among the Comanche, where her gift was not just accepted, but revered. She had found her people in the most unexpected place, among those her former world would have called enemies, and had discovered that healing knew no boundaries of blood or birth. Her hands, once hidden in shame, now reached freely toward any who suffered, carrying the medicine of touch and the deeper magic of understanding. Sometimes, in the deep of night when the wind whispered across the plains, Ruth would press her scarred palms together in gratitude for the strange path that had led her here, through captivity and terror, through shame and hiding, to this place where broken things could be made whole again. She had learned that the greatest gifts often came wrapped in the darkest packages, and that sometimes what seemed like an ending was really just the beginning of something more beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine. Her hands, marked by suffering but transformed by love, had become instruments of grace in a world that desperately needed healing.